Russia is losing the Black Sea and Ukraine is forcing Putin's ships to retreat. And while in 2022, Russia controlled about 90% of the Black Sea between Europe and Crimea and could thus block Ukrainian ports using Sevastopol as its main base, today the situation has changed. In fact, Ukraine has used missiles and naval drones to strike Russian units, forcing Moscow to withdraw much of the Black Sea fleet from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk along the Russian coast of the Caucasus. I've noticed that many of you watch my videos and I'm really happy about it, but you're not subscribed to the channel, so if you enjoy my content, please subscribe. It's free for you, but it's really vital for the project. Thank you very much. Control of the Black Sea was one of the objectives of the Russian invasion of Ukraine because Moscow aimed to conquer the coast, occupy port cities like Odessa, and turn Ukraine into a country with almost no access to the sea. With economic and strategic consequences that would have been very serious. In fact, the Black Sea connects Eastern Europe to the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, where Ukrainian goods and agricultural products pass every year. That's why, in 2022, Russia blocked the Danube area and the ports of Odessa and Mykolaiv, leaving about 25 million tons of grain stuck in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the global price of wheat was almost 60% higher than in 2021. This caused problems, especially for countries relying on Ukrainian imports. However, Russian dominance did not last long, and its first setback came in April 2022 with the sinking of the cruiser Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Then Ukraine also began to combine land-based missiles, surface drones, aerial drones, and attacks against naval infrastructure, managing to hit expensive ships using low-cost systems. And this forced the Russian Navy to increase its distance from Ukraine and to continuously strengthen the defenses of its bases. The fact remains, however, that until mid-2023, Moscow still maintained relative control over about 60% of the sea between Crimea and Georgia. However, a new series of attacks between August 2023 and March 2024 forced most of the Russian units to leave Sevastopol and withdraw toward Novorossiysk. And by April 2026, Russia's maneuvering space at sea had shrunk to about 25%, with Moscow's fleet now operating almost exclusively in a strip about 25 kilometers near the Caucasus coast. By contrast, Ukraine controls the timing and pace of operations in over 60% of the area, also thanks to the constant threat of drones. But note this! Kyiv does not control more than half of the Black Sea with its own ships because Ukraine does not have a large conventional fleet, but it is able to ensure that Moscow cannot move freely in the Black Sea. And the Russian losses concern both the destroyed ships and the operational capabilities that the fleet can no longer maintain because Ukrainian attacks have reduced Russia's ability to conduct long-range missile attacks by about a quarter and anti-ship attacks by almost 40%. Yet the amphibious component has been hit, with 7 out of 12 Russian landing ships destroyed or damaged, thus reducing Moscow's ability to support operations along the coast and making the future possibility of a landing to capture cities like Odessa even less credible. Anyway, Russian losses are estimated to be between 25% and 75% of their naval capabilities, and the range is so wide because there are differences between the various units. In fact, we're talking about surface ships, logistics, amphibious ships, and so on. And so Novorossiysk has remained the only major Russian naval base fully operational in the Black Sea. But moving the ships from Crimea to the Caucasian coast has increased the distance from the Ukrainian theater, thus reducing their usefulness in the conflict. This is a major blow for Putin, as Crimea was meant to be Russia's main military stronghold in the Black Sea, but instead it's become a constant Ukrainian target due to its heavy militarization and its bases, radars, and connections supporting Russian forces in occupied southern Ukraine. Connections that are, however, increasingly at risk. In fact, the attacks from 2022 onward against the Crimean bridge have reduced its transport capacity because it is too risky, while the attacks against radars, airports, anti-aircraft systems, and naval installations have made it more difficult to protect the entire peninsula. Land connections in southern Ukraine's occupied territories are becoming riskier, partly because they're closer to the front and Ukrainian drone operators. And now pay attention, because if the bridge were really made completely unusable and Ukraine were to simultaneously manage to cut off the other connections, Crimea would truly risk being completely isolated from mainland Russia. And in the meantime, it must also be said that because of the Ukrainian drones, the Kerch Strait, where the Crimean bridge is located. Just to be clear, this has also created a pressure point for Russian commercial shipping. In fact, while on June 6, 2026, more than 40 ships were waiting to cross it, by July 11 there were far fewer after, according to Kyiv, Ukrainian attacks had hit as many as 116 ships in the Sea of Azov. Paradoxically, the situation may be reversing. Previously, Russia aimed to block Ukrainian trade, but now the opposite is occurring. However, the most important economic consequence is that Ukraine has managed to restore a good part of its maritime exports, victims, and this despite the fact that Russia has repeatedly tried to block them to damage Ukraine's economy. However, it must be said that this was also thanks to the grain agreement mediated by the United Nations and Turkey in July 2022. An agreement, of course, that involved Ukraine and Russia and allowed the reopening of exports from Ukrainian ports. And by March 5, 2023, it had allowed more than 23 million tons of agricultural products to leave Ukraine. And this agreement was vital because during the first 4 months, it accounted for 60% of Ukraine's total exports of corn, wheat, and barley. Even though between January and November 2022, the volumes were still 22% lower compared to 2021, but after all, a large-scale conflict had broken out, so that's understandable. But then in 2023, Moscow withdrew from this agreement. More precisely, Moscow withdrew from the agreement in July 2023. However, Ukraine still managed to create its own trade corridor along the coasts of Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. Obviously, this was thanks to the reduced freedom of action of the Russian fleet we talked about, and to Ukraine's ability to strike enemy ships that might try to approach. But how is it possible that Russia is having such a hard time controlling the Black Sea? The difficulties also depend on Russia's ability to replace the lost units. And this also, and perhaps above all on the one hand, because in 2022, Turkey enforced the Montreux Convention, which is an international agreement signed in 1936 that gives Turkey control over the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits. Turkey then closed the Bosporus to warships from the parties involved in the conflict, and this prevented Russia from transferring new ships from other fleets into the Black Sea, thus limiting the possibility of compensating for losses and effectively protecting the Ukrainian coasts. And the rebuilding of the fleet is also hindered by costs, the lack of components, and the reduced production capacity of the Russian naval industry. In fact, a 2025 study estimates that Russian combat readiness in the Black Sea has decreased by more than 40% compared to the beginning of 2022, mainly due to the lack of repair capacity, the loss of spare parts, and the use of obsolete units. Then, Western sanctions against transport and insurance would have contributed to a 27% reduction in the volume of Russian goods passing through sanctioned ports between 2023 and 2024. Meanwhile, the output of Russian shipyards is estimated to have decreased by about 35% between 2022 and 2024. This is also due to the loss of access to propulsion systems, navigation devices, and microchips from Europe and Asia. But now, pay attention, because the transformation of the Black Sea also directly concerns Europe. In fact, the seabed of Ukrainian waters could contain over 1 trillion cubic meters of natural gas, while Romania's Neptune Deep has reserves of more than 100 billion cubic meters, and Turkey's Sakarya field exceeds 700 billion cubic meters. These are all resources that are in the Black Sea and could contribute to European energy security in the long term, if wars allow. In fact, in May 2025, the European Union published the Union Strategy for the Black Sea, focusing on the protection of infrastructure, maritime surveillance, and cooperation with NATO and Ukraine. The Union, however, and this must be said, has not created a permanent naval mission and continues to depend on the voluntary contributions of member states and on the presence of NATO. With Turkey, which therefore remains indispensable because it controls the straits, possesses the largest regional naval force in NATO, and is also modernizing its own fleet. But it must also be said that Ankara maintains a particular position. In fact, on one hand, it supports Ukraine in certain areas and sectors, and prevents the entry of Russian ships through the straits. However, on the other hand, it does not break off its economic relations with Moscow and does not fully implement Western sanctions. This is to say that a stronger presence from Europe in the region would be very important, and above all, that it is necessary to continue supporting Ukraine. Do you think Ukraine can fully reclaim its waters from Russia? Share your thoughts in the comments, help build the hype, and subscribe if you enjoy my content. Bye.